You've compared the dangers of ecstasy to horse riding.
Well, obviously you haven't read the paper, have you? But that was a carefully considered analysis. This is the part of the issue. Here you are trying to argue the science. You're not a scientist. We are saying that if you want to reduce harms and death, you should tell the truth.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the 𝙎 Files. I'm your host Simon Doherty, and today's guest is Professor David Nutt, one of the world's leading neuropsychopharmacologists. Professor David Nutt used to be the UK government's chief drugs advisor, but in 2009 he was sacked because some of his work compared different drugs and concluded that alcohol is often more harmful than many illegal drugs. The government didn't want to hear that, so they promptly fired him.
Writing in the Times, he said it seems any true scientist will not be able to work for this or future Home Secretaries. But Alan Johnson is standing by his decision.
The following year, he founded 𝙎𝙤𝙬𝙚, a not-for-profit scientific programme that provides free, evidence-based drug information without political influence. Some of his most popular books include Drugs Without the Hot Air, Minimising Harms of Legal and Illegal Drugs, 2012, Drink, The New Science of Alcohol and Your Health, 2020, and Cannabis, Seeing Through the Smoke, The New Science of Cannabis and Your Health, 2022. Also Psychedelics, which was published the following year in 2023. The following interview is your questions taken to him. Let's go. The alcohol book did make me think very seriously about my drinking, because it made me realise that, you know, there's a lot of different dangers that you don't really see in popular culture. So the first question that came in that's relating to that is there any safe amount of alcohol to consume that's completely safe?
That depends on whether you have a genetic vulnerability to cancer. So if you're one of the people, particularly women, who carry the BRCA gene, which predisposes to various cancers, particularly breast cancer, then alcohol probably should be avoided, because you are at it's one of the few things you could do to reduce your risk of getting cancer. If you don't have that genetic vulnerability, then the current regulations, current recommendations of threshold maxima, which is 14 units a week for men and women, if you stick within those with one proviso, which is spread it out, don't drink it all in one go, then your risks of dying from an alcohol-related disorder are very low. So those limits are actually quite sensibly crafted. So don't drink them all at once. Have ideally 2 or 3 days a week when you don't drink, and then if you want to drink up to the 14 units a week, spread it out.
Okay. On that, someone also asked, why do you think the government ban certain drugs? Because they say that they're dangerous, but they protect the alcohol industry.
Well, because the alcohol industry has much more clout and leverage than the unregulated drugs industry. Of course, if drugs were regulated and sold in pharmacies, then there would be a profitable drugs industry, which would also bring taxation to the country, which would also then have some credentials and some income to do lobbying. And so the government would probably listen to that industry to some extent, as it does to the drinks industry. But the drinks industry has been extremely clever. It has, since that made that sort of convulsion in America and Sweden and Norway and Finland in the 1920s when they banned alcohol, the drinks industry has become very sophisticated at protecting its niche, to a point, you know, where it's only 10 years ago that we were actually, the government, the Home Office that regulates drugs, allowed us to say alcohol was a drug. In fact, my sacking was caused by my pointing out that actually alcohol was the most harmful drug in the UK, and they said it's not a drug. And in some countries like the US, it actually is still not formally classified as a drug. So the drinks industry, powerful, clever at lobbying, keeping politicians on side. They do it in two ways, interestingly. Should I share that with you? They do it by by being extremely generous to politicians. So the drinks companies they have open bars in the Houses of Westminster on a regular basis every fortnight. And they don't just get in politicians into those bars, they actually bring in newspaper editors. So there's a kind of collusion amongst the people that make the law and the people that complain about the law, that they won't confront the drinks industries.
And the fact is that to have a social drink is never a problem. Whether it's the journalist that's in there that seem to spend as much time as a member of parliament in there, that's where stories are exchanged, a bit of knowledge is exchanged. And, you know, filling up some diary piece within a newspaper usually has come out of strangers' bars.
Eric Joyce, a former army major who once had hopes of being a government minister, is now accused of assaulting a Tory MP after being led away in handcuffs following a late-night fracas in a House of Commons bar. He's accused of headbutting Conservative MP Stuart Andrew, who says he suffered a bloody nose and is determined to press charges.
And then the second thing they do, which is now they're doing less and less well because of the response I gave you to my first question, in a way, was that they make their health claims for alcohol. And those health claims, like, well, for middle-aged men, a glass of red wine might be cardioprotective. We now know that those really can't be substantiated. So we've taken down one of their pillars of deceit, but we're still struggling with the political one. They do it also very cleverly they don't just give politicians free booze, but they also massively fund the hospitality industry. And the hospitality industry is very generous. Politicians like to travel in the midterm and end of term breaks, and they do that. The hospitality industry is very good at getting them around the world to do all sorts of things, and the drinks industry fuel that.
Okay. Have you ever been approached by any lobbying groups or offered any incentives to sort of to lie about science?
I haven't. I think they probably know that would be a pointless exercise.
Okay. So 3 people in total asked about for an update on 𝙎𝙬𝙪. So do you want to explain, just for anyone in the audience that doesn't know what that is and where you're at on that project?
Okay, so 𝙎𝙬𝙪 is a concept. It's a vision, which has actually now been transmuted into substances, into molecules. And the vision is to find a small molecule to replace ethanol, which is also a small molecule. But ethanol is a very promiscuous small molecule which targets multiple different neurotransmitters in the brain, affects so many different neurons that it's impossible to make an antidote to it. It's impossible to block or restore all the damage it does. So, wow, it was 20 years ago when I was actually in favor with the government on the government's foresight report for the Department of Trade and Industry. We came up with the idea of replacing alcohol. And modern science allows us to do that. So we came up with the concept of 𝙎𝙬𝙪. 𝙎𝙬𝙪 would be to alcohol what canderel, some of you may know canderel is an artificial sweetener that is put in many drinks and foods to give it sweetness without calories. Mm-hmm. Now, it's an obvious thing to do. It would be a radical solution to a massive global problem. But it's proved very difficult to get investors. And it's weird, really, isn't it? 2 reasons, I think. One is that that a lot of rich people like to drink and they don't want to really think about what they're drinking, and they drink expensive wine, and they're often, they don't drink so much of it, they get into problems. The second is, and this is the most bizarre one, people say, well, it's never been done, so why should we invest in something that's never been done? And you say, well, hang on a second. Electric cars had never been done until they were done, and they're changing, the way in which we use fossil fuels. Solar panels hadn't been done until they were done. What's so different about doing something to drink? And then they say, well, drink's not a technology. It's a pleasure. It's a fluid. All sorts of confabulation coming. So we haven't been able to raise money to take those small molecules or to develop more of them and to do all the safety testing. But what we have done, and this may be known to some of your listeners and viewers, is that we've tried to make something which we can make and sell, which is which are botanical drinks called Scentia. And now we have 3 different Scentias, which are a bit like vermouth. So you use different mixers with them to get the flavors and the taste you want. We've also launched a botanical alcohol-free but functional whiskey and a cider. And we're working on some champagne and some canned drinks. So we've managed to kind of reproduce the concept of 𝙎𝙬 by using botanicals that are in the food chain or established as food safe, and brewing them in a way which gives the product, gives the ingredients that actually then go into the body, go into the brain, and mimic the effects of a low dose of alcohols. So we've proved the concept. We're in the process of selling them. We haven't made any profit yet, but when we make profit, then we're going to invest it back into the 𝙎𝙬 concept.
Yeah, my favourite flavour is the orange one, actually, just for the record.
Yeah, so the latest. Yeah, I think it's great on a summer day, you know, with
a bit of soda water in there as well. This video is brought to you by Easy Test Kits, quick, reliable and affordable drug testing kits. If you want to learn more or pick up a testing kit yourself, head to the description down below and use my promo code SESH for a 10% discount. Another question that came in was, how do tolerance breaks work neurologically? So an example is cannabis. You know, if people use cannabis regularly, they don't have the effect that they used to have. Now, their choice then is to either up the dosage or to have a break for a month, for instance. How does that work neurologically? When the receptors return, are they changed by this process that they've been through?
And I'll be quite candid with you. We know very little about the brain mechanisms of cannabis tolerance. It's rare, it's hardly studied in the same way as cannabis is hardly studied, because it's still an illegal drug, despite 6 million users. There's no commercial interest in it really, so the companies aren't studying it. There's very little funding from research councils. So we don't know very much about our cannabis tolerance. And we don't actually, to be honest, have the tools which we might have we do have for other drugs, to actually measure, for instance, cannabis receptors and their function in the brain. But what we can say by extrapolation from other drugs is it usually tolerance for most drugs occurs at the level of the brain. In some cases, theoretically, it can occur at the level of the liver. You could break down the drug faster. You can enhance metabolism. But for most drugs, for most psychoactive drugs, the tolerance occurs in the brain, and it usually occurs through the receptors that the drugs work on internalizing. So they're no longer available for the drug to work on. And then when you stop using the drug, they come back from being inside the cell. They come back to the surface. So it's like they disappear, and then when the drug's gone, they come back, because there's obviously some sensing of throughput through those receptors, which then leads to them moving. But another interesting thing that can happen is that when you've got a complicated molecule like, say, alcohol, which works on multiple receptors, you may see a change expression. So some of the receptors it starts working on may down-regulate, as we call it, and others may up-regulate to compensate. So there can be 2 separate mechanisms, a sort of compensatory mechanism and basically a blunting, a tolerance through receptor down-regulation mechanism. So then when you stop, that process reverses, and there are again elements to it. There are local elements in terms of where the receptors are in the cell membrane, and there are gene elements. We know, for instance, for drugs like benzodiazepines, we can see that the gene that makes the receptors and there are many of those, there are 15 different genes. Some are switched on when you use it, some are switched off. So you can see the gene signature changes as well. Really, but we didn't kind of emphasize much smarter to take the break than to increase the dose. Much smarter, much cheaper too. And also it's a downward spiral. So it really is a fantastic harm reduction message. If you can have these breaks, then please do, because it'll protect you. Your brain will reset. The only thing you've got to worry about, and that is actually well known for opiates. It's not so well known for cannabis, and that's not such a worry because cannabis isn't really toxic. But it's also, and less well known for alcohol, if you stop for a while, the receptors will reset and they will be normally sensitive. And that is a huge problem for people who are forced to be abstinent from heroin.
In prison, for instance. Yeah.
In prison. That's the most dangerous 2 weeks of your life if you're a prisoner. Actually, for everyone, the most dangerous day is your day you're born. But after that, the next most dangerous time is for prisoners who use opiates who come out of prison. Those 2 weeks are their very, very high risk of dying, because if they've not used in prison, they've lost tolerance. They come back and they use the dose that they were using before, and then they die. So that's a critical thing to take on board. And in fact, there's quite a lot of research going on how to protect people against that. And of course, the easy way is to give them an antagonist, naltrexone. There are injections of naltrexone. We could even use buprenorphine, the injection of buprenorphine, Buvidol. That would protect people against overdose. But of course, you can't force people to do that. And you just need to hope that you want to make those drugs are really available to prisoners before they come out of prison so that they can protect themselves.
Okay. So I've got another question here. It says, I'm a 68-year-old raver in excellent health. I did not take any drugs for 40 years, and now I'm back at it, but I only take MDMA. I do not have a crash at the end. I feel very good for a few days later, but I've been told by several people that I should only indulge once every 2 to 3 months. How often is it safe, given that I haven't had any bad reactions? Well, safe firstly is a problematic word, isn't it? Because all drugs have the ability to be dangerous. So I'm going to rephrase the last bit. Is there any additional risks for taking MDMA too often?
If you're older, yeah. So the answer is, there are so few people like you that we don't have the evidence. But thanks for sharing. And if more people did share, we'd get a bit closer to the truth. Typically, older people are more sensitive to drugs for 2 reasons. One is that their metabolism tends to be slower, so they don't break them down so fast, so they tend to get higher plasma levels. And also, particularly for sedative drugs, as people get older, their cognitive capacity, their brain capacity tends to reduce, so they tend to be more vulnerable to depressant type drugs. On the other hand, we know that there are disorders where people have been prescribed stimulants for a very long time. I mean, one of the things that I find kind of most amusing about the whole methylamphetamine story and the sort of challenge that methamphetamine, crystal meth presents society is the medicine. And there are patients in this country who are in their 70s and 80s with a disorder called narcolepsy, where they fall asleep too quickly or inappropriately, who have been on methamphetamine for 70 years, and it still works. So I think we can say that if you're using it within the bounds, or using stimulants within the bounds of the therapeutic dosing, they're probably fine when you're old. And there's no particular reason why MDMA would be not follow that pattern. In fact, it might even be, frankly, somewhat even less likely to be problematic, because it doesn't increase blood pressure and heart rate as much as amphetamines. So how frequently should you take it? I've always been of the view that probably no more than once a month or every couple of months, just to be absolutely on the safe side. We know if you take an awful lot, then there's you can downregulate some of the key receptors in the serotonin system and the transporters. So I think, 6 to 8 times a year perhaps would be a reasonable harm reduction kind of message.
Okay. Someone said, I was recently diagnosed with breast cancer and I've stopped drinking alcohol. As part of my treatment, I'll be taking, and there's a drug here I don't recognize, but it's ribosocimab.
Right.
For 3 years and letrozole for 10 years. I'd like to understand how MDMA might interact with these medications. I'm a very infrequent user, I'm also interested in mushroom oil, so psilocybin. Is there any known interactions or safety concerns?
Well, I can say categorically that those studies have not been done and they will never be done. The answer is, I don't know. The way to approach this, though, is to go onto the web, look up those drugs, see if they interfere with any of the liver enzymes. They're called CYP450 enzymes. See if they interact with those enzymes. If they block those enzymes, or some of them, like the 2D6, then they could actually slow the breakdown of MDMA. So that would be the pointer you would use to if they don't, then it's unlikely to change the metabolism of MDMA. But your comment about and again, I think the sensible advice, if you're not sure, obviously use a low dose if you know what the dose is, or if you don't, take a quarter of a tablet or something, see how it is. Now, with mushrooms are really interesting now, because this is something very new we haven't told the world about yet, so you're going to hear it first on here. We know that many cancer survivors get a great deal of emotional and psychological benefit from taking mushrooms. And they've approached me, and they've talked about it to other people as well. There's actually quite a significant number are going to the Netherlands for mushroom truffle retreats, and they're coming back and talking about it. So in fact, our charity 𝘎𝙧𝙪𝙜 Science has just got some funding to pay for some women to go and who've got cancer, mostly breast cancer. It doesn't have to be breast cancer. And I'm going to say now, all the slots are full. We don't have any spare slots, but this is happening in a couple of months' time, and we're going to monitor what happens and also film it. The narratives, the stories that these women have told me have been so powerful and so compelling in terms of the benefits they've gained, that I actually thought, we've got to do this. We've got to expose the barriers to this kind of access. We've known really since the 1960s that psychedelics can help people come to terms with life-threatening illness. Even since they were banned, there have been studies, good studies done in the Johns Hopkins and New York University, showing that people confronting end-of-life challenges like cancer, like motor neuron disease, get very significant benefits from psilocybin. And I find it really disappointing. I find it makes me angry that people with cancer have to go to the Netherlands or to Peru or Brazil or somewhere to get ayahuasca when they could have it in the UK. So we're hoping to name and shame, in a way, the government into doing something to facilitate access in the UK. So that's the first thing. You can read, you'll follow me on Twitter and follow 𝙎𝙧𝙪 Science, and you'll see how that pans out. And hopefully the film will come out before the end of the year. But the second thing we're trying to do, and this is more challenging, is we're trying to do a similar treatment in the UK. So that we've got a bit of money to facilitate that, and we have to do that under the guise of research, which is not easy, because it won't be a hardcore research trial, but it will be, again, a sort of proof that you can get benefit from these exposures. And actually, we're hoping to do 2 studies in the UK, or not studies, but we're hoping to treat 2 groups, and one of them will be a men's group, because men generally are much less open about cancer. They're much less likely to talk about it. They quite often don't seek psychological support, and we want to make it all clear to them that actually they're equally eligible, and they're probably equally responsive to drugs like psilocybin to help them come to terms with their cancers. So this is a hugely important area, and although I cannot recommend, I make it very clear to your correspondent, I cannot recommend, I can say that a great number of people have found benefit, and hopefully we can establish that sort of in a much more clear and apparent, transparent way in the next few months or years. There's a European grant called 𝙎𝙬𝙾𝙗, which is also actually doing a more systematic study of 𝙎𝙬𝙾 in severe illnesses, one of which is cancer. And that's funded by the European Commission, the European Research Councils, and they're doing cancer survivors, they're doing people with Parkinson's disease, they do people with terminal lung disease, and also people with severe motor neuron disease. So you know, there are scientific justifications for doing it. So and I think if I had cancer, I wouldn't wait for the science. I'd actually think carefully about whether I wanted to do it myself.
Okay, fair enough. Again, I got 3 questions about this. A lot of people think that the drug driving tests, roadside tests in relation to cannabis are unfair and unfit for purpose. And the reason is basically because people might not be impaired, but they might have some cannabis in their system. They might have, for instance, smoked a joint 4 days ago, and they're driving their car. They might be pulled over by the police. They provide the police will provide the roadside test, comes positive. They then get banned from driving. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, they're exactly right. It's outrageous. So the story is this. When, I think it was probably 12 years ago, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, she asked a friend of mine, Kim Wolfe, who's Professor of Toxicology at King's College London, to do a systematic report on drug driving. And that report was a good report, and it made recommendations on what the plasma levels of drugs should be that would be indicative of impairment. And the comparison was alcohol. So, you know, why would you want to have a different threshold for other drugs than alcohol? And what Theresa May did was effectively reduce the levels of all other drugs by between 5 and 10 times. And so that tells you that the drug driving law isn't about impairment. What it is about detecting people who've taken drugs. And it's a way of trying to deter people from using drugs. It's punishing people for using drugs. And that is particularly reprehensible for cannabis, because we have masses of data showing that cannabis doesn't impair function after 24 hours, but it can be detected for a very long time. And so there's a peculiar cruelty about that. And of course, this is what happened in prisons when they started drug testing in prisons. We don't know why they did it. We know what happened though, and I'll tell you this story now because a lot of people don't know, and this has become hit. This has been hushed up. The original question of drug, what drugs do prisoners take is kind of an interesting question. It was done by a group at King's College. They studied a couple of prisons, and they showed that prisoners, interestingly, they do take drugs, various drugs. They take heroin, and they take some prescription drugs, and they also smoke quite a lot of cannabis. So you got a report, and people thought, well, so what? And then, for reasons which we don't fully understand, probably partly political, probably partly commercial, because the companies that do drug testing could see, I think, a massive commercial opportunity. I mean, if you test every prisoner every day and you charge for each test, there's actually quite a lot of money in that. So there was a massive lobby for drug testing in prisons, and it kind of fitted in with the conservative, and the Labour hatred of drugs and prisoners. So against the wishes of the prison governors, we had drug science. We had the chair of the Prison Governors Association talk to us about this in about 2015. He said we were horrified because we were told we had to test our prisoners without consultation. So what happened was, of course, that loads of them got picked up for having cannabis. They could have smoked it days or weeks before. Well, what happened then, and this was the cruel thing, that their sentences, they got the time off for good conduct was removed. So they might have a third added to their sentence. Now, prisoners are not stupid. And the first thing they did was stop smoking cannabis. But as you can imagine, as most people, some of you would have, prison is such an utterly demoralizing and pointless and boring place that the only way to survive is to take drugs. So what did they do? They switched to heroin, because heroin's out of the system within 24 hours. So there was a surge of heroin deaths in prison. And and then what happened was that people didn't want to die. So people started looking for alternatives to cannabis. And the synthetic cannabinoids came along. And of course, they weren't picked up by the detection kits. They were very powerful. They could be smuggled in small amounts. They could be smuggled in, dissolved in, on paper that had been soaked in them and smoked. So they created this enormous market for spice. And, between sort of 20 and 30 prisoners a year die of spice, because spice is it's way, way more toxic than cannabis. No one's ever died of cannabis in prison. It also produces not just deaths, but states of enormous, severe intoxication, often needing a lot of restraint. So most prisons now have little platoons of paramedics, big male paramedics, to deal with the spice problem. And it was all because this hatred that people have, or the politicians and others have, of wanting to keep on punishing, as if being put in prison isn't punishment enough. So, basically, most drug testing is about punishing people for using drugs rather than helping them be safer when they have used them.
Obviously, you founded Drug Science in 2010, which is a fantastic resource that's helped my reporting, invaluable to my reporting over the last 10 years. And in there, you've got a lot of harm reduction information, and it's free from political bias. That's a big thing about Drug Science. Now, I was going to ask you what you thought about the Online Safety Act, which is now essentially banning any harm reduction information for children between the ages of 16 and 18. So before, they would have been able to go onto social media and sort of see some of this harm reduction information, but now they won't be able to do that, and the only resource that they'll be able to sort of look at is Talk to Frank, and that's the Home Office.
We don't have an age limit for drug science. I mean, it does not make sense, does it? It really doesn't. And but we have never endorsed harm reduction in this country. I mean, we were not even one of the reasons I got sacked as the advisor was because we were not allowed to write harm reduction in the government reports. For 20, 30 years, the drugs policy was all about stopping people using, even though it was actually making people use more dangerous stuff. Now, at least harm reduction's there, but I'm with you. It's something that should be really explicit. But there's another very sinister thing happening in social media, is that they're beginning to block any talk about any drugs, which means, people can't seek help. And also science, people are blocking emails which talk about drugs, and particularly social media. And so everything's being driven to the worst possible place, which is kind of outside of the knowledge base into the underground.
So there's a question here about, I used to love raving, but I had a heart attack last year and had 1 stent put in. I am now on a range of meds for blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. My question is, how harmful would it be if I took a small amount of anything, specifically asking about LSD, mushrooms and MDMA? Well,
generally, small amounts, it depends on what you mean by small amounts. So sub-psychedelic doses will have very little effect on the cardiovascular system. MDMA is slightly different. I mean, MDMA is more cardio-activating than the psychedelics. I think the risk for this person would be if he wanted to do a lot of dancing when he was on the MDMA. I would avoid that. But if you're using it for kind of more experiential and spiritual purposes, or therapeutic purposes, then having had a stent wouldn't be a problem. In our MDMA trial, which we did, what we've done in healthy volunteers, but also in people with alcoholism, and they're quite ill. they've come off, they've been detoxed for alcohol. We found it was relatively, well, I think we only had one person in which it put up blood pressure, even in that group of people who are quite vulnerable. And of course, you can measure your blood pressure. So maybe, if you're going to use it, use a small dose, measure your blood pressure. If it's fine, then you at least you can be reassured, because often anxiety is as big a driver. Our experience with psychedelics is more that it's the anxiety of what's going to happen that puts your blood pressure up more than the drug itself.
Interesting. Someone else has asked, how addictive is ketamine? What's happening neurologically when someone becomes dependent, and what should they do if they're struggling?
Yeah, well, that's an extremely important question. Ketamine is it's definitely not free of addiction. Okay, everyone can see that, because and the reason for that is that you get tolerance. But like with opiates, you can overcome the tolerance by taking more, and then you get more tolerance. So you take more, you get more tolerance, you get more, and so you take doses which, if you took the first time, would anesthetize you, but you can be taking grams a day because you're so tolerant. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that ketamine and its metabolites damage the bladder, and so in time your bladder will become can become extremely inflamed to the point where you're in chronic pain. And everyone knows about the 𝘿-cramps, which is sort of the beginnings of irritation.
It's an abdominal pain, right?
Yeah, that's right, in the front, down here by your bladder. Yeah, that's right. So the 𝘿-cramps are ketamine inflaming the bladder. And so obviously, health, harm reduction. If you get 𝘿-cramps, you're damaging your bladder, okay? So think about that, because if you don't, and you keep on using, you will eventually destroy your bladder. And there are, I don't know now, probably about 100 people in Britain who've had their bladders removed because they're in chronic pain from ketamine. And having your bladder removed is a bad thing, because it means that your pee is going straight from your kidneys outside. And that means that there's much less barrier between bugs on the outside and your kidneys, which means that if you're a 25-year-old who's lost their bladder, you're probably going to lose 10, 15 years of life, because eventually your kidneys will get infected and they will just be destroyed, and you'll either need a kidney transplant or you'll be dead. So 𝘿-cramps is the sign. You've got a problem. Stop. Now, how do you stop? That's the challenge. How do you stop people using ketamine? And the answer is, we don't know. We actually really don't know. But the good news is, in 2 weeks' time, 𝙎𝙤𝙬𝙘 Science is having a presentation from a group in Birmingham who are researching this. And there are two challenges, really. The first challenge is how you get people safely off huge doses of ketamine when they're dependent. And secondly, how you keep them off. And so that's something which they and us are thinking quite a lot about at present. And we've got one or two ideas. I'm not going to share them at present because they're still ideas and they need to be validated by at least informed, knowledgeable other opinion. But it's an important topic, and we're working on it. So if you follow drug science, we will be putting stuff out there over the next year, which hopefully will tell people at least in which direction to be going and help guide doctors to help people come off.
And there'll be links in the description for anyone if they want to follow drug science. Another question is, do you think that addiction risk in ADHD is primarily psychological, or is it more about people using substances to regulate an environment that feels like it wasn't built for how their brain works?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So yes, we know categorically that people with ADHD tend to have a higher prevalence of drug use, not just illegal drug use, but also alcohol and legal drugs and tobacco. So the reasons for that are twofold. The first is that quite a bit of it is self-medication. So using stimulants like coke or crack or crystal very often they often don't get the same effects as others. They don't get high and buzzy and become life and soul of the party, but they do actually get relief from their continuous swirling thoughts, etc. So they often get calm and balanced. So and then they can become secondary dependent on that. And often they use alcohol and I guess things like ketamine and that in order to dampen down, again, this sort of the chronic mental restlessness. So they are more vulnerable. That's the first thing to say. The second thing is that we know that medications for ADHD, specific medications, particularly lisdexamfetamine and methylphenidate, reduce the risk. They take away the need for self-medication, so they reduce the use of what you might call it illegal stimulants, and they can help people regulate the use of other drugs. So that's the first point of call. The problem is that even most doctors, even some who are treating people with ADHD, have the belief that they shouldn't give them drugs in case they will become addictive, even though in fact they need the drugs in order to stop being addicted. So there's a lot of misinformation there. But if you have ADHD and you are struggling because you're using drugs which are illegal and going to get into trouble, particularly criminal record, etc., then there's a much 30 years ago, I set up the second ADHD clinic in Britain, in Bristol University, to help adults. Everyone thought ADHD was a disorder of kids. We now know it's not. We now know that perhaps 20–25% of people who have it as kids don't grow out of it. And also some people develop it as adults from things like brain injury. So adults need help. And we do have quite a lot of clinics now. And in fact, the ADHD is one area where the government's actually accepted that there's an unmet need and is investing in therapy, in doctors. So if you're in that camp, it shouldn't be so difficult. You'll have to wait 6 months, but eventually you will get access to therapy.
Okay. Someone said there seems to be clear evidence that cannabis can be used to treat chronic pain, for instance, but there's also some bold claims over the years about it being able to shrink cancerous tumours. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, in fact, there was a lot of evidence back in the 60s and 70s, before the real clampdown on drug use came in, that cannabis had utility against a range of tumours. And that all got suppressed. And then, of course, has been hardly researched since, because working with cannabis is very difficult, because until recently in the UK, it was a Schedule I drug. It's still illegal in the US, even though many states have made it available as a medicine. So there's relatively little research. The best research, actually, interestingly, was done in Israel, where they're doing some quite sophisticated studies on the different ingredients in the cannabis plant for different cancers. So yes, so I think if I had cancer, I would definitely be looking on the net to find out what the evidence is that my cancer might respond to cannabis. Not just because of the pain, but also because it might reduce the size or the rate of growth. It's one of the real missed opportunities in modern medicine is cannabis and cancer.
Okay. Another question here. Please ask why the smell of weed hangs around for ages when the smell of cigarette smoke goes quickly. Is there anything chemistry-wise there? Or?
Yeah, I presume it's because the terpenes, particularly that that give the smell of cannabis, so they're probably they're quite sticky. So I suspect they stick to things. So that's probably the smells coming not from just from the air, but from where they've descended. But I don't know categorically. I don't know that.
Yeah, it seems it's probably a question that's coming from a university student hall somewhere.
Well, it's a huge problem, though. I mean, and we shouldn't laugh. I shouldn't have laughed because, of course, I'm giving a talk on Wednesday to sixth formers in London, and I did it last year, and I showed them student Q, the schoolgirl that was strip searched, the black schoolgirl who was strip searched. Mm-hmm. A lot of them don't know about it, but they do know about it after my talk. And then I explained to them why she was strip searched. She was strip searched because she smelt of cannabis. There was no evidence she was smoking cannabis. Her parents could have been smoking, her brothers and sisters. But because she smelled of cannabis, she was stripped. So I've had this happen also to a mid-20s Italian student who was strip searched in London by the police because they said she smelled of cannabis. Outrageous. And you know, it's a huge. And of course, police dogs are easily trained to smell cannabis. Even so, is it? But now cannabis is a medicine. You know, it's quite outrageous that anyone should be being stripped or searched at all for smelling of cannabis. So it is an issue, and I think maybe that's what's behind that question. And yeah, people should take it seriously. I mean, I think it's getting less. I think, you know, hopefully the police are beginning to learn, but there's still a lot of police who don't even know cannabis is medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I haven't been taught. We had a drug science session on that. Well, there's one of the police experts is now trying to teach policemen that cannabis actually is a medicine, and you can't just arrest people because they've got it on them or they smelled it.
Yeah, it's just obviously it's decades and decades of stigma that's so ingrained into society. It's very difficult to roll back for some people.
Absolutely.
Someone's asked, can you give an example of a time where the evidence has completely changed your mind about something?
Well, yeah, MDMA. So when I first went into the Home Office, when it was the sort of giant concrete monstrosity just across St James's Park in I think probably 1992, and because of the deaths that were emerging, a few deaths from MDMA, and up to that point, I assumed MDMA was actually quite dangerous, and I was brought in because I knew a lot about serotonin, and when we began to explore the question, we realized actually it actually wasn't the MDMA that was killing you. It was the way in which the clubs were restricting access to water. So people were dehydrating and were getting hyperthermic and were dying. And I realized actually I'd been misled. You know, I'd kind of believed what people had published, which was MDMA was toxic. And it became quite clear over the course of a year or so working on that program that actually it was the way we dealt with MDMA that was toxic. And that brought in interesting things. It brought in changes. It brought in the specification, recommendation, which eventually became a regulation that clubs and bars and restaurants must serve tap water. If people want it, they cannot be denied water. It also brought in the recommendation for chill-out rooms, which some clubs instigated, which was great. We couldn't make it a regulation. And everything actually went pretty well with MDMA until the WHO and the UN decided to start to try to ban the precursor, Safrole, in 2008. And then things went completely ape because people started trying to get around the ban and made other drugs like PMMA and PMA, which killed people, and then cracked the way of making it without Safrole, which made MDMA much cheaper. So now the pills went from 80 milligrams to 250 milligrams. So just a savage attack on MDMA has just made MDMA way more harmful than it ever was.
Very interesting. Someone said, I'm a member of the British Armed Forces. Please ask, what does he think of the military's zero-tolerance drug policy? For me, given the fact that they tolerate us consuming beyond excessive amounts of alcohol, I find it a bit absurd that I could be discharged for smoking a spliff.
It's utterly ridiculous. Many of the commanders, many of the senior people particularly in the practicing military, they know that, and they hate it. And I remember talking at the Armed Services Club 15 years ago about this, and these colonels were coming up to me and saying, "What can we do?" And I said, "Well, always make sure you don't test it until Thursday, so there's a chance for it to have washed out of the system." And yeah, I mean, and if you, I mean, it really, losing talented soldiers because they go and relax with their, mates or at a weekend or whatever. So really never test on a Monday. That, and some of them do that. Some of them refuse. There's definitely resistance. But when you get to the senior, the non-practicing, the senior bobs, the generals and all that, who are aspiring to get into the House of Lords, well, they've got to parrot government policy. So, and this actually, by the way, this is broader than just recreational drug use. It's also therapeutic drug use. Soldiers and their commandant, the practicing soldier, frontline soldier, from all levels, from colonel down, they know that trauma is the biggest danger. The psychological consequences of war are more likely to kill you than the physical consequences. And they want access to treatments like MDMA and psychedelics. But we've been campaigning for that for 15 years. The senior military won't support it. So now you've got military charities of ex-combatants like Help for Heroes who are just doing it themselves. But it really should be being pursued by the senior people. And in Australia it is, by the way. Australia 2 years ago rescheduled psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD for and MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD. And just a few months ago, that was kind of for private use. Now, the Australian military are getting funding. The government is funding that therapy for their military, and it's really sad and outrageous that the UK military isn't prepared to stand up and say our soldiers deserve it as much as the Australians.
Very interesting. Yeah, fair enough. I had a couple of questions about periods. When people are on their period, do drugs affect them differently?
Yeah, well, that's pretty unresearched. Almost all the studies we do, and when we do studies in animals, we usually use male rats because periods complicate things. When we do studies in women, periods also complicate things because you have to do twice as many studies because you've got to do studies when they're having their period and when they're not having their period. It's even more complicated because actually either side of the period things have changed. So there's disappointingly little knowledge there. But yes, we can say categorically that sensitivity to some drugs do change quite dramatically through the period. And that is that's largely because the hormones which go up and down, the estrogens and the progesterones, they're actually neurotransmitters or neuromodulators as well as being hormones. So obviously their major role is actually in the uterus and to some extent in the ovary, but they do have these roles in the brain, and we don't fully know why that is. We presume there's some kind of value. We presume that there's particularly during pregnancy, one of the theories is that pregnancy is such an unpleasant experience for women, such a stress that the very high levels of progesterone go in the brain and kind of calm the brain and take away some of the tension and also some of the memory. There's it's well-known phenomenon that my wife called amnesia gravidarum. She had 4 kids, and with one of them, I think the third one, she lost a purse, and she found it 3 days later in the fridge. She forgot. I don't know why she put it in the fridge, but she had, and the argument goes that the damping down memory of the misery of pregnancy is quite useful because that means you're not deterred having another baby. But there's another interesting twist to this, and it's not all women go it the same way. And this is quite a fascinating piece of biochemistry. So progesterone can be metabolized in 2 directions. For most women, it's metabolized in a direction called allopregnanolone, and that's the calming, relaxing, sedating consequence of high levels of progesterone. But in some women, another enzyme predominates, and that metabolizes it to progesterone sulfate. And that is the opposite. That actually it increases anxiety, and it can cause seizures. And there are some women who have epilepsy where the seizures come very clearly at the time of the menses, and that's because the progesterone is being converted into this pro-convulsant substance. So there are individual variations, and we don't really understand. That's probably at a genetic level, we presume, but we haven't characterized, I think, the gene. Well, we know the genes that do it, but we don't know whether there are the people with epilepsy around the pregnancy, around period time, actually have a variant of that gene. It's something that should be studied.
Interesting. And so there's a harm reduction message there, is there, for people who have periods that use drugs?
Yeah, I think it's some women say, you know, they do become very sensitive to alcohol when the progesterone levels are high, and they become less sensitive afterwards. So yeah, I mean, but I think women are quite aware of that. And again, we can't be directive. We have to tell people to think about it, monitor, and if you find that you're vulnerable, then obviously use less or take a break.
Mm-hmm. And there was another one that came in on periods. It says, I've noticed that MDMA temporarily stops my periods. The cramps stop 30 minutes in, the bleeding pauses a couple of hours in, and it doesn't return until around 18 hours or so later. Has there been any research on this?
No, but it doesn't surprise me. There has been almost no research on MDMA. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, it really is, it's a scandal. It's an absolute scandal. Not partly because, you know, you've got millions of people all over the world using MDMA on a regular basis. And well, I'll just tell you a story. I mean, until we did the imaging of MDMA in the brain 10 years ago, no one had done it, and no one would fund it. Governments just would say, well, it's an illegal drug, so why should we study it? And I remember saying to funders, well, there are two reasons you should study it. The first is if a lot of people are using it and you're telling them it's harmful, maybe you want some evidence for that. They didn't like that because they prefer lies to evidence. And the second, and the much more important one in a way, is that we knew it was therapeutic before it got banned. So why wouldn't you study it to find out why it might be therapeutic and maybe begin to develop alternatives? If you believe MDMA is harmful, and you know it can be in very high doses, you know, why don't we work out what it does and then try to find other ways of doing that with a less harmful? So, but there's virtually no reason. Almost every single paper, say 95% of all the papers ever published on MDMA, were funded by people wanting to show harms. They were funded to get the result that people wanted, which is this drug is dangerous, it damages your brain, damages everything else, so let's keep it banned. However, clearly what this lady is describing is fascinating, and there are several possible theories I would have about why that might happen. They relate largely to the endocrine effects. So MDMA is obviously, it has effects in on the release of serotonin and particularly serotonin, that's where you get the empathy and it's where love drug. It's an entactogen, has some effects on dopamine and on noradrenaline too, which is where you get the energy from. But it also releases oxytocin, and it's quite plausible that oxytocin actually can have that effect on the uterus. It also releases prolactin, and it's possible that, and it releases other hormones from the hypothalamus, like antidiuretic hormones. So it's probably a hypothalamic effect of MDMA that's doing it, but again, certainly not in any way studied appropriately.
Interesting. Someone said that I am prescribed benzos. I have one pill a day, half in the morning and half at lunch. Why is it, I've been told not to drink. Why is it so dangerous to mix benzos and alcohol?
Well, they're both sedatives and they both work in different ways. So their effects can often be, well, they will be additive, but they also could be multiplicative. So that's the warning. I don't know what strength is, but you know, you can certainly, alcohol's effect will be magnified if you're on a benzodiazepine. So you just need to be knowledgeable about that and actually drink less. You get the same effect by drinking less. So that's actually, it makes it cheaper.
And so the danger comes if you're over intoxicated on them, you might fall over and injure yourself, or is it about your central nervous system sort of reducing in its efficiency?
Yeah, very few people die of respiratory depression from alcohol and benzos. But yeah, you're dead right. You're quite likely to be unsteady and fall over. I mean, the big dangers are benzos and heroin or opiates, because they both suppress respiration, and of course alcohol and opiates, which suppress respiration and lead to vomiting and inhalation of vomit.
Why do you think some people still believe that vaping is as harmful as smoking, or even more harmful, when all the evidence seems to suggest that obviously it's much less harmful? So what is the current evidence on that?
Well, the current evidence is what you just said. Vaping is probably at least 10 times, maybe 100 times less harmful than smoking. People don't want to believe it for two reasons. One is that there are people who make their lives stopping people using things, even nicotine they don't like. I mean, you know, to get rid of nicotine, they'll probably get rid of caffeine as well. You know, I mean, there's some people for whom any use of anything that changes the way you feel is some kind of moral insult. And there are others who are just ignorant, and often that ignorance comes from being around at the beginning, campaigning against vaping and not wanting to be proved wrong. I mean, and it's a really fascinating example of Australia. You've got to compare Australia and New Zealand. You've got two countries, similar genetic background. They're all Western Europeans, you know, similar economies. Australia's a bit richer. In Australia, they ban vaping. And in New Zealand, vaping to them is the way to stop people smoking. And they've achieved that in 10 years. New Zealand has virtually massively reduced tobacco smoking in almost all the populations except the Maori. Australia hasn't had any impact at all, because we know that most smokers would prefer to vape for health reasons and also other reasons, you know, in terms of, you know, they don't smell so bad, and, you know, it doesn't mess with their gums and their teeth, etc. So yeah, but the Australians won't change, because their leading experts came out against vaping early on. And there's an interesting angle to this, which I guess most people don't know, is that 20 years ago, Australia led the world in reducing smoking tobacco, because it brought in plain packaging. And that did have an impact. Stopped advertising, brought in plain packaging. That did have an impact on use. So they're proud. They were really proud of that. And I used to champion that. I used to say, great, you know, I'm really pleased what Australia's done. But then when other people came up with the idea of vaping, they did what many experts do. Many experts see other experts as threats. And so rather than embracing the truth, embracing the opportunity, they just started bad-mouthing it. And it's called, you know, it's not, if something's not discovered by you, then it's got to be wrong. You know, you have this sort of intellectual arrogance, and that's the trouble. And then when their experts started shouting out against vaping, they had to keep banging that drum, otherwise they've made themselves look really stupid. So Australia is really lagging behind both the UK, New Zealand, and the US. In the US, young people almost don't smoke tobacco at all now. They just vape. And actually, they don't vape much either. That's it. That's the other interesting thing, because vaping is less addictive than smoking. When people start vaping, they don't get as hooked, so they can stop more easy.
Interesting. If you were in charge tomorrow, and you only are in charge of drug policy in the UK, how would you change it?
Well, I do what I've been saying for a long time. I decriminalise personal possession of drugs, which, by the way, last week, there was a big Irish report suggesting that Ireland should do the same. So I hope that goes through in Ireland. It will work, but it will only work if you actually have other policies to support people stopping. And, you know, so when you find people using drugs, you need to help them stop using. Otherwise, decriminalising without trying to get people off if they're addicted isn't very effective, as they showed in Oregon. Whereas in Portugal, where you do have other sanctions and you do have treatment, it does work. So that's the first thing. stop people getting criminal records, which drives them out of education, drives them out of training, drives them out of jobs, and interestingly, drives them out of the army. So I had a patient once who was a university graduate who said, I was caught as a student smoking cannabis, and so I got a criminal record, and I wanted to join the army. And they said, well, look, you're clearly officer material because you just completed this university degree, but you have to go in as a private because you've got a drug record. But and in the States, of course, you've got this horrific burden. If you get a drug record, you can't get free education at university. So I mean, the punishment. So, and we get rid of all that crap, and then I think the threshold has to be alcohol. Drugs which are less harmful to the user than alcohol should be available in a regulated fashion, such as in pharmacies, in regulated shops, possibly for some people requiring a doctor's note saying you don't have some kind of medical illness which would be dangerous to use the drug with. That's what I would do. So that would be the threshold. If they're more harmful than alcohol, and there are enough of those to appease the anti-drug brigade. There's crack and crystal and probably cocaine now. To be honest, we're seeing more harms from cocaine, but other, heroin, etc. Then you would they would stay illegal, But the hope would be if people had access to less harmful alternatives, you'd reduce the use of the very harmful drugs in the same way. In Portugal, they massively reduced deaths from opiates by having a policy of treating it as an illness rather than treating it as a criminal behavior.
So the idea with these drugs that would be available, people would be buying them in a pharmacy setting, not in like a commercial shop.
Yes, there is real dangers of commercialization. That's kind of what we've seen with alcohol. We would like to reduce the commercialization of alcohol. We would like to stop advertising, which we did for tobacco, but we haven't done for alcohol. We would like to reduce incentives like 2 for 1. There are sensible things you should do for alcohol, which would apply to other drugs being sold. I mean, I like the concept of cannabis cafes. Personally, I think we should have nitrous oxide cafes, and they could be they could have a separate room for nitrous oxide and as well as alongside cannabis. Those kind of places where people can use drugs safely and sensibly, where there are people to look after them if something goes wrong and educate them, makes perfect sense to me.
And since you were famously sacked, do you think that we've come far anyway to having a more rational policy or a rational debate around drugs in this country?
Well, we have a debate, which we didn't have before. We're not necessarily winning the debate, because obviously the banning of nitrous oxide was another example of how we've lost the debate, how the media and the last Tory government became hysterical about whippets, completely moronic, and now created much more problems we've got much more harm from nitrous oxide now because of the canisters. 500 times more people are taking far too much nitrous oxide than they could ever take with balloons. They're getting spinal cord damage, and they're getting also severe frostbite. They're putting the canisters between their legs, and they're coming. The second biggest cause of burns in burns units today, the biggest one are actually lithium batteries, and the second biggest ones are nitrous oxide canisters freezing people into burn. So we created that monster. We created anyway, basically we've done a lot of dumb things, but we are having the one good thing we've done is allow cannabis as a medicine from 2018. It's hardly reached out into the populace, but at least in the NHS, but at least it's available. And of course, we've got some police chiefs that are being very sensible about cannabis and not arresting people. We should make cannabis available in shop or in cafes or both. Yeah.
Why do you think that some of the newspapers are really turning on medical cannabis now? For instance, the Times. There seems to be every other day they have a negative story about medical cannabis. Why do you think that is?
Drugs are an easy target. The reason heroin was The reason we have a heroin problem is because newspapers attack doctors for prescribing heroin to heroin addicts. In, what was it, 1970, we had 1,000 heroin addicts. The newspapers hated them. We stopped prescribing. And in 20 years, we had 300,000 because they had to become addict dealers. So the newspapers just like to attack people, particularly people that don't buy them, don't care about them, have a different lifestyle to them. I have this theory that every newspaper editor, like every Home Secretary, has to have banned a drug in order to say I've really achieved something. It is infantile and pathetic. And but it gets, newspapers are about getting people to buy them or read them. And if you lie about something, well, there's no consequences in the newspaper, other than you might actually get more readers. So it's a kind of, it's partly the public's lack of maturity as well.
And what are you hopeful for? What are you hopeful about?
I'm hopeful about psychedelic rescheduling and MDMA rescheduling, like in Australia. I think that has to happen because the mental health burden in this country is so vast and the benefits of these medicines are so enormous and they work where others have failed, that this is my big campaign at present. So watch this space. We're pushing to get rescheduling this year.
Well, thank you very much, David. A great fan of your work. I'll have links to the books in the description and links to Drug Science. And thank you very much for taking the time today.
Lovely to talk to you. Thanks, Simon.
All the best. Thank you.